Don't you love that one little kid? How could you forget us? And isn't it so true as adults? Sometimes it's from the mouth of babes that we are reminded of the important things in this world. And I just have the great privilege today to come and speak to you about what God is doing in the world and to maybe expand our horizons just a little bit. But before I do that, I just want to remind you of who we are as Tearfund. We are the official relief and development partner of the Free Methodist Church in Canada. And so we have the great privilege of representing many Free Methodist churches across the country in the work that we do. For those of you that don't know Tearfund, we are formerly World Relief Canada. And some of you will remember us back from the days when we were World Relief, and now we're Tearfund. Tearfund, just for those of you who don't know, actually stands for something. It stands for the Evangelical Alliance Relief Fund. And so in that capacity, we represent you as disaster happens around the world. And even more importantly than that, we represent you in our development projects in the sub-Saharan Africa, where we're working and helping to alleviate poverty around the world. I want to say a huge thank you to those of you at Barrie Free Methodist Church that do regularly support the work of Tearfund Canada. Thank you for engaging with us in that important ministry and helping us to do the important work that God has called us to do. At the beginning of September, I was traveling in southern Ethiopia, and one morning I got up at the hotel that I was staying at. I went up the hill, and as I got to the top of the hill, I noticed that there were a lot of what I would call important government people walking around. And so I went up to my partner and I said to him, there's a lot of important people here this morning. And I said to him these words, I said, aren't you glad that we serve the most important person, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords? And he turned to me and he said, yes. And we're also more important than them because we serve the poor. Wow. Doesn't that kind of hit home? Right? As we serve the least of these, we are elevated in God's grand scheme of things. And so I want to invite you into the story of how do we serve the poor and what does it look like. And we're going to dissect that as we think about this important question this morning. Who is my neighbor? You know, it's an interesting question, isn't it? And as you think about who your neighbors are, probably the thing that immediately comes to mind are the people that live around you in the neighborhood that you live in. And so you think about those people as you think about who is my neighbor. But as we reflect on this question, who is my neighbor, we think back to the scriptures, and often this question kind of jumped out as Jesus interacted with people, and they were thinking about this exact same question: who is my neighbor? This question, which may seem simple at first glance, carries profound significance in our daily lives as followers of Jesus Christ. If you're anything like me, when you first reflect on the question, you immediately think about, the people that live around me, they kind of think like me. Maybe they even look like me. Generally speaking, we have the same kind of thoughts about life. But this simple question has deep significance, and Jesus, in his infinite wisdom, responded to answer this question with the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I know that as I say the Good Samaritan, many of you are immediately taken back to some Sunday school setting somewhere where some dear saint began to teach you this little story about the Good Samaritan. And if you're anything like me, you would confess that it's easy to kind of get lost in some of the details of that story, to miss the fact that Jesus is actually saying to each and every one of us, what will you do with the story? And do you realize this morning that the story is not simply about those in your neighborhood around the Barrie Free Methodist Church, and what an incredible testimony we've had this morning about you interacting with those neighbors. But the story is about all people on God's great big planet, and how do we see and understand our response to those neighbors? At Tearfund Canada, we are often thinking about those neighbors in faraway places. We're thinking about some of the poorest of the poor who are living in what we call at Tearfund extreme poverty. Now, it's kind of hard for us to even get our minds around what can extreme poverty actually look like and be. And in our simple thinking, we think about extreme poverty as living on less than $2.50 a day. And as I often like to say as I speak at churches on Sunday morning, many of you here this morning spent more than $2.50 on your way to church. So it's hard for us to actually get our minds around living in extreme poverty. We are constantly thinking at Tearfund Canada about those who are dealing with the ravages of climate crisis. And do you realize that we are living in a climate crisis, and so often it doesn't really affect us as much here in North America. But the people in the global south are affected on a daily basis with the ravages of climate. We are constantly thinking about those facing the pain of war, conflict, and the brutal implications of their region of the world. I think this morning about our partner in the DR Congo, and they're facing the conflict between the work that they are trying to do, and they're planting gardens and helping people with food. But their tragedy is when they plant those gardens, the rebels come out of the jungle and steal the food. Can you imagine if that was happening in your community garden, Pastor Jen? Just when things were looking good, somebody comes and takes it all away, and you've got no control over it. And we were delighted just 3 weeks ago at our staff meeting to hear that our partner in the DR Congo was actually able to engage in conversation with the rebels to say, please don't take all the food and think about the implications of this. But that's their daily reality and struggle. And at Tearfund Canada, we are constantly thinking about those parents who are making difficult decisions about what mouths to feed each day and what children to send away to the city to fend for themselves. As I was in the city of Soto just 3 weeks ago, the street kids were everywhere. And your first thought is kind of like, okay, the mom and dads have sent the kids to play on the street. No. Mom and dads have sent the kids to live on the street because that's their reality. And so we are invited today to go beyond church walls and think in fresh ways about our neighbors right here in Barrie, across this area and this region, and around the world. And we're going to do that this morning with this beautiful parable, a beautiful story that Jesus engaged people with in Luke's Gospel, chapter 10. And so if you have a Bible with you or you want to pull it up on your phone quickly, let's go to Luke's Gospel, chapter 10, and the parable of the Good Samaritan. And as we're reading this, I just think it's such a beautiful story. As we're reading it, be thinking about where do you find yourself in the parable. Luke's Gospel, chapter 10, and we're going to start reading with verse 25. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. Most of us get that part of it, right? And then he goes on, he says, love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But this young guy was kind of a smart aleck. And he wanted to justify himself. And so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, When he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expenses you may have." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." It's interesting at first glance when we kind of read the story. We see many different responses to this wounded man. For the expert in the law, the wounded man was simply a subject to discuss and talk about. There was no connection with the depravity of this man and how wounded he was. To the robbers, the wounded man was a person to exploit. Let's see what we can get from him. To the religious men, the wounded man was a problem to avoid. We don't want to go there. To the innkeeper, the wounded man was simply, let's be real about it, a customer to serve. I can get something by taking care of this wounded man. But to the Samaritan, the wounded man was a human being who needed to be treated with dignity and worth and cared for and loved. And as we see all those different responses to this wounded man, perhaps we can even see ourselves fitting somewhere into that story of how we relate to our neighbors. In this parable, and I can just imagine people kind of listening in, what's Jesus going to say to the question of who is my neighbor? He's unfolded this beautiful story about the one who's traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho. He's shown us all the different responses about how people are interacting with each other. And as he's unfolding all of those different responses, he's inviting people into the story of how would we respond if this is where we found ourselves. Because I can well imagine, as he's interacting with this scholar, this religious man, everybody else in the crowd is listening in. Yeah, we can see that being true. We can see that taking place. And as he gives them this response, as he's drawn the Samaritan into the story, he's challenged all of their thinking about how you treat people. I find it very interesting that the Samaritans were so hated by the religious rulers of the day that they could not even speak the word Samaritan. Look at verse 37. Jesus, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert of the law replied, the one who had mercy on him, not the Samaritan. That was the level of hatred that was passing through this conversation. Now, there's a lot of things that we could learn from Luke chapter 10 and the story of the Good Samaritan. And maybe even as I'm talking this morning, there are different kind of lessons that are coming to your mind. But I would suggest to you that one of the central messages is about being a good neighbor. How can we be a good neighbor? What does that look like? And Jesus challenges us to redefine our understanding of neighborliness. He shows us that being a good neighbor is not restricted to those who look like us and live around the corner from us and speak like us and share our beliefs. Rather, being a good neighbor means extending kindness, love, and assistance to all, especially to those in need, regardless of their background or social status. And can we just pause here for a second and say that this scripture and being a good neighbor is especially applicable to our world today? And all of the divisiveness and anger and walls that have come up between human beings. And in all of that, Jesus would say to us today, when you are a follower of Jesus Christ, you live differently, you act differently, you think differently, and you treat people differently. Can I just get an amen to that? As followers of Jesus Christ, we are going to live in a different way. See, I don't know who actually made this little quote that's going to come up on the screen, but it's this. It is our willingness to act with empathy and kindness that defines our character. It is our willingness to act with empathy and kindness that defines our character. The Good Samaritan, and at the core of the story, teaches us to see beyond our prejudices and differences. Now, we can be honest and say that's not easy to do. It comes difficult for many of us. And even maybe some of you are kind of struggling with somebody that's not like you or thinks like you or whatever. But the Good Samaritan reminds us that we are all interconnected. And the well-being of others is tied to our well-being. The Good Samaritan challenges us to break down the barriers that divide us and recognize the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. And so how does this relate to the work that we do at Tearfund Canada? We have the great privilege of being partners with the church in the Global South. And all of the work that we do is done through local church partners who are working on the ground. And we have some incredible partners in many of the countries that we are working in, and one of those partners is in the country of Kenya. In Kenya, we have a partner, and they're called Fideli Trust. They've been working there for many years, probably about 20 years now, amongst the poorest of the poor in Kenya. And at the core of their work is something called church and community transformation. Church and community transformation is a biblical model of development that works with local churches, helping them to go beyond their walls and beyond their barriers and address the unmet needs of the wider community, physically, emotionally, socially, and spiritually. Essentially, CCT is answering the question, who is my neighbor? I want to introduce you to one of those churches that have been working in a place called McQueen County. And we're going to hear the story of what this church in McQueen County did with someone who was especially in need, and I think you're going to be encouraged by their story. Let's show the video.
I was born in 2000. My father died in 2003. After I finished my school, my mother was ill and she left us in 2021. She had a green grocery, and after the burial, I started the green grocery to educate my siblings and also to get food from there.
After her mother died, Mercy took on the sole responsibility of raising her 12 siblings and cousins, as well as her own child. But earning enough to feed so many mouths is challenging. The increased cost of living combined with intense drought means that the family often go without basic necessities.
Due to the high cost of living, the food has become high prices. So sometimes we do lack food. The school fees is also high. I'm running a green grocery, which has low benefit, leading to some coming home for school fees and also skipping some needs like clothing and food.
But Mercy is determined. Part of Mercy's motivation to help her family comes from the memory of her mother.
My mom was a loving person. I hope one day I'll be like her. She used to counsel people, helping the needy and loving the orphans. I copied the behavior and decided to stay with my cousins and be one family.
Seeing Mercy's situation, the Good News Church of Africa Yinzao is helping to support Mercy and her family. Empowered by the Tearfund church-based community transformation training, the church is providing them with food and other supports.
Kanisa walichuzi kusupport Mercy kwa sababu ni total orphan. Tuko na orphan kwa hili kanisa, lakini Mercy ni total orphan na pia ndiye breadwinner wa ile boma. Na still ni nyumba ndogo sana. Waliachwa wakiwa watoto wadogo. So kama kanisa tukachagua kusimama na ile familia.
Despite the challenges, the key thing that keeps me going is prayer and encouragement from the church, my pastor, and some of my friends. The church do help me in prayers, in material things like food. They tell us the word of God and they keep us going.
Tearfund is working with churches like Mercy's to provide families with physical supports, training in climate-smart agriculture in savings groups, and spiritual care to help people lift themselves out of poverty. For every $1 invested in a church through CCT, a societal value of $211 is created. Local churches are the most effective way to transform a community.
My hopes are that I continue with my education career and also to expand my business. To the religious organization in Canada that fundraise to help people in my situation and others in worse situation like mine, I'd like to thank them and appreciate for the work they are doing. May God bless you.
As an Outpour partner, your monthly contribution of $50 helps one family, like Mercy's, to lift themselves out of extreme poverty and strengthen the local church to uplift its community. Join an outpour of God's love for families like Mercy's in the world's poorest places.
Isn't that a beautiful story? Anybody else find it kind of interesting that here we have a lady named Mercy? She goes to Good News Church, and she's ministered to by Pastor Grace. Grace and mercy, the good news. And here's this lady, Mercy, her mom had died, she was left an orphan, 12 people more in her family. And really, as we learned about her story, we learned the beauty of what happened, and Pastor Grace in the Good News Church saw the need. And even though they live in this area, McQueen County is incredibly dry and desolate, and I've stood there in McQueen County and I've seen what it looks like, Pastor Grace said, the Good News Church is going to share the good news. And we're going to help this young lady, and we're going to empower her with this incredible burden that she has upon her. And we're going to help her to feed others and feed her family. And we're going to lift her out of poverty. See, the beautiful thing about Mercy's story is that the church responded. The church responded. And the story shows the power of the local church to meet the physical and spiritual needs of the community they're placed in. They are meaningfully responding to the question, who is my neighbor? Going beyond the walls of the church and going into the community and being the hands and feet of Jesus Christ. Exactly like we were invited into in the story of the Good Samaritan. The parable in Luke challenges us to reflect on our own attitudes and actions of how we see others. And in a world that so often emphasizes those boundaries and those walls, the parable of the Good Samaritan serves as a powerful reminder of our responsibility as followers of Jesus Christ, to demonstrate his love in meaningful and powerful ways. And so my opportunity this morning here at Barrie Free Methodist Church is to encourage you with what God is doing in the world, to tell you the story of Mercy and Pastor Grace and how God is going above and beyond. And I hope you were encouraged by the power of what $1 can do that was shared in the video. For every $1 invested in Tearfund's church and community transformation programs, there's a societal value of $211. You want to talk about a good investment of what God can do when God's money becomes multiplied. It's powerful to see. And so my opportunity here at Barrie Free Methodist Church is to invite you to go beyond your personal walls and to maybe even consider becoming an outpour partner with us at Tearfund Canada. Our outpour partners are valued monthly partners who help us in the work that we do. See, the beautiful thing about stories like Mercy is we don't simply give her something and then leave her. The beautiful thing is she's a part of a church community. And so as we empower local churches across the global south with church and community transformation, they're training people. And it's through the church that families are trained with new farming methods that sustain them in difficult growing conditions. And every single farmer who practices these new farming methods sees at least a doubling of the yields off their fields. And so there's surplus that happens. And with these new farming methods, they're able to see that surplus and join self-help groups. And the self-help groups become the economic engines of community. And at the end of the road and at the end of the story, the hero of the story is always the local church seeing transformation in their communities. Development, changing people, and the church is at the center. And at the very end of it all, people like Mercy have new hope and a reason to smile for the future. And this is all possible because God poured his love into you, and it now overflows with an outpour for other people. And so my prayer today is that God would raise outpour partners here at Barrie Free Methodist Church who would join with us in telling the beautiful story of what God is doing right across the global south, but also right here in Canada as we see ourselves as a part of the story of the Good Samaritan. May God bless you.